You didn't know you were on
All
camera.
right, now I'm officially starting. Today is July 26, 2004. My name is Benjamin Bederson, Professor of Physics Emeritus at New York University and Editor-in-Chief Emeritus of the American Physical Society. We're gathered here today to engage in some reminiscences of three distinguished theoretical physicists and their wives, all except one, theorists and their wives. While most of these reminiscences will be based on the experience of these three men, I am inviting the wives to interject comments as they feel appropriate. I will first ask everyone to introduce themselves, who they are, what their present positions are, where and when they were born, and we'll do it in seniority with the eldest first, which is Ed Gerjuoy.
My name is Edward Gerjuoy. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, May 19th, 1918. Presently, I am Professor of Physics Emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh.
Sidney?
My name is Sidney Borowitz. I was born on June 12th, 1918. And presently I'm a Professor Emeritus of Physics at New York University.
I am Larry Spruch. I was 1923. I'm a Professor Emeritus of Physics at New York University.
All right, let me start with the oldest, Ed. Ed, please tell us a little bit about your early bringing up, who your parents were, where did you live as a child, what were your interests, what was your schooling up to, say, college? Take your time. We got plenty of time.
My father's name was Abraham. He actually came to this country as Abraham Greenberg, but his original name in Russia was Gerjuoy. And when he came to this country, the immigration officer didn't seem to know how to spell Gerjuoy, so he insisted he be called Abraham Greenberg. But my mother, who had ways of her own, refused to marry my father unless he changed his name back to Gerjuoy. So that's why I am Edward Gerjuoy.
Was your mother American?
No, I was going to say, my father came to this country in 1905. He was born near Odessa. My mother was born in Romania, and I'm not quite sure what year she came here, but she came to this country about 8 years old.
1901.
Not yet. She came to this country, she was 8 years old. My father spent his life working in the garment industry. My mother actually, he never had any formal schooling after coming here, although apparently was reasonably well educated in Russia. My mother was educated here, and she became a school teacher, and she taught elementary school for her entire life until she retired. I lived originally on Watkins Street in Brooklyn, in the East New York section. Then my parents bought a house on East 51st Street in Brooklyn. But I actually went to elementary school where she was teaching. She was teaching in public school 156, which was not far from Ulitz Avenue. And I went there, and then as a result, after that, I went to junior high school, 149, and I went to the high school, Thomas Jefferson High School, all in that area. And from the very beginning, I seemed to have an interest and talent in math. I never knew anything about science, but my father was he was, first of all, a very good card player. He's a terrific card player. And he was able to do things which I remember very clearly, for instance, that after I learned algebra, for instance, learned something, I would give my father a problem, and he would work it out, get the answer without any understanding of algebra. Somehow or other, he had his ways of working it out. So my father did that. In any event, I was always interested in mathematics, as I say, and when I got to high school, well, I should also explain, my mother taught me, I whizzed through undergraduate school. I got out, I skipped and skipped and skipped, and then I finally got tired and I refused to skip anymore. But I ended up getting out of high school at 15, as did my friend here. And in high school, at Thomas Jefferson High School, I joined the math team, and I was a member of the math team there, which is where I first met my friend here also, Sidney Borowitz, who was a member of the math team at Boys High School. So that's where we first got to know each other. And that was where, I think that brings you up to my college days.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me ask you, did you have any interest in science before college?
I do not think so. I took chemistry when I was in high school, in my next to last year, I think, in high school, but I was not particularly interested in it, and I did not take physics at all in high school. My first term in physics was in City College, and Sidney, again, will remember this. He and I were lab partners. When we got to City College, we had a small incident with my college teacher, which Sidney will remember, which I'll tell you about.
Okay, we'll go to Sidney Borowitz.
Well, as by this time everybody knows that I'm Sidney Borowitz. My parents both came from Poland. I know more about my father's background than I do my mother's. My father was well educated, but he was only well educated in the Hebrew, in the things that make people interested in Judaism. He had no formal education that you would have in the kind of education you would have if you were born in America, the United States. I must say that Ed reminded me of the sort of things that my father was able to do. I remember particularly algebra problems, like if somebody did some kind of work in 11 days and another did it in 7 days, how long would it take for them to both do it together? He taught me how to do these problems. In fact, he used to do them mentally. Well, I'll give you some other things about my father, but it happened after I was in college. My father was very smart. Now, about my mother, I don't know very much about her education. My mother was the sole surviving child of a family of about 12. And they sent her to the United States because the other kids, her other children were dying, and they thought that would save her life, which it probably did. She had practically no family here. My father had no family here as well. My mother was not very well educated, even compared to my father. She had a great deal of difficulty with the English language, though she managed after a while to be able to be understood where she had to be. When I corresponded with her, for example, I used to correspond with her solely in Yiddish.
In later years, you corresponded with her in later years.
What? Now, about my interest in the science, I don't recall ever having an interest in science even past junior high school. My ambition in those days was to be an ornithologist. And I knew a great deal about birds, which I've now forgotten. However, when I went to a real high school, I had a brother who was a very great influence in my life. My brother he was 5 years my senior, and he had been to Boys High School, which is the high school I went to in Brooklyn. And those days it was actually a superior high school. I had no complaints about my high school education. And he told me, he said, you better join the math team, and which I did. And as I recall, Ed, we came out ahead of you at the end of the thing.
You did every time, but as I recall, I did better than you individually.
Well, unfortunately, the medal that I was awarded by coming out first in team has somehow or other disappeared. So I can't think. I should say something about the math team at Boys High School. I don't know how many of you remember a film called The Apartment, but it was written by I.A.L. Diamond. I.A.L. was on the math team the year or two after I graduated, and IAL stands for Interscholastic Algebra League. Well, that really completes the thing. However, there is something else that was an enormous influence in my life. I had a friend, a bosom friend, from the time I was in junior high until we graduated. His name was David Gilborg. He died just last year. He was a professor of mathematics and chairman of the department at one time at Stanford University. And he had the most influence for me in becoming interested in mathematics. He had a brother, Hank Gilborg, who was actually a physics major at the University of California, but he never succeeded in doing very much, and then he died. Courant first came to New York University, and he gave mathematics courses and let anybody who wanted come into the class, and he and I both attended classes. One was in the calculus of variations.
But that was in graduate school? Well, we'll get to that later.
No, this was while I was still in high school.
Oh, while you're still in high school? Oh, sorry.
One was in the calculus of variations, and the other one I forgot, maybe it was just calculus.
Wasn't Dave a year behind you? Wasn't Dave a year behind you at Boys High?
It might have been, I don't know.
My recollection is, I don't know about, my
He
recollection...
might have been graduated a year after.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because my recollection was that the first year you were there and that Dave didn't show up until the second year, but I don't, in City College, but I'm not sure that's true.
Thank you. Anyway, however, we were inseparable friends. Literally inseparable. I can't remember a friend at that era that was closer to me.
Okay, Larry?
I can't tell you where my parents were born, because when I asked my father, he said it depends on which year you're talking about. Part of the time it was Austria, part of the time it was Hungary, part of the time it was Poland. Both of my parents were largely uneducated, especially my father. Both of them could nevertheless multiply two numbers by two numbers without any education of any kind in their heads. And they were both, more importantly, very, very sensible people who had a big impact on my life without knowing anything about anything. There were two things that I understood when I was a child. One was that it was important to get an education, and the other was that, I can put it this way, I was 15 years old, is a joke, before I realized that the word union and the word good were two different words. And that's the way I was brought up. But they had no influence whatsoever on my life as a scientist. When I graduated from high school, I asked them, do you think I should be a physicist? And my parents, in the heart of the Depression, told me that they were ignorant people, they knew nothing about physics, they didn't know what the word meant, but that I shouldn't do anything for the sake of money. That's the only advice they ever gave me as far as my educational career was involved. My earliest experience of science was a very sad one. When I was in public school, the teacher announced that the following day he was going to teach us how to erase the blackboard scientifically. And I spent hours thinking about how you could erase it in a blackboard scientifically. And the next day he came in and he took the eraser, he went down like this, then he moved over and he went down like this, then he moved. So my first experience of science was very disappointing. But then I went to high school, and I had a physics teacher who knew no physics, none. He knew a little bit of biology and not much of that. And it was New Utrecht High School, it was a very poor school, and there was one book in the library. And in that book I learned that you could tell the period of an orbit of a planet from the radius. And I thought that was fabulous, but I only knew how to do it for a circle. I didn't know how to do it for an ellipse. My teacher didn't know the difference between a circle and an ellipse. But then I had a mathematics teacher who could not pass an exam for teaching. He was Russian. He had no understanding of pedagogy. There were 25 people in the class. There were 2 of us that were mathematically oriented and 23 who couldn't do anything. So he used to give out 10 extra points so they could raise their average. So I and the other guy used to get 110 on every exam we ever took. And being completely stupid, it never dawned on me in my high school career, because he taught me probability theory, calculus. He taught me and the other guy. The rest of the kids had no idea what was going on. And it never, ever occurred to me to thank him. I didn't think of those things till years later. And then I decided, on the basis of that one book I'd read, that I wanted to be a physicist, but the counselor at New Utrecht High School knew nothing about these matters. And I said, I'd like to be a physicist. He said, you can't make a living in physics, which was true. He said, what else can you do? I said, I don't like it nearly as much, but I have some ability in mathematics. He said, you can't make a living in mathematics. But if you like mathematics, you can study accounting, which is the poorest advice I've been given in my entire life. And I'll tell you more about my career when I get to college. So that's my background to some large extent.
Did you have any interest in science before you got to high school?
I never knew anybody who had the slightest idea what science was. All of my relatives were uneducated. I mean, some of them had...
So you knew nothing about science?
No,
yourself?
nothing.
Any friends?
I didn't learn anything until I got to high school, and then I didn't learn very much.
Now let me start again with the oldest, Ed. Ed, go back now and be a little more personal. I'd like to hear about your religious experiences, if any, your political involvements as a child. What influence did your parents have on your subsequent career, if any? Were your parents important for you in your early lives and your development of your careers? And how did they affect your later development? And also talk a little bit about your friends and about your neighborhood and your social background.
All right, it's a fairly large mouthful. Let me begin with
You have 5 minutes to do it all.
my parents and their influence on me. First of all, my mother taught school, and for the first 5 or 6 years of my life, I was essentially brought up by my grandmother. My grandmother lived very close to us, and later when we moved to East 51st Street, my grandmother occupied an apartment downstairs, and we occupied the apartment upstairs. And so for the first 5 or 6 years of my life, first of all, Yiddish was as good a second language, I mean, essentially equivalent language to me as English. I had cousins who lived in the same area, and those whom I played with, there were one girl who was about a year younger, and an older brother who was about a year older than I. But because my grandmother, and because my mother always wanted to be sure that the neighbors didn't, whatever it is, she looked good in terms of the neighbors. I actually was sent to Hebrew school, and I spent the years from 8 through 13 going to Hebrew school in the afternoon, every afternoon. Now my father, who had been much more religiously trained than my mother, but was a complete atheist, he thought it was nonsense. But in arguments between my father and my mother always won because she persisted, and my father simply didn't have the energy to keep up with it. So I went to Hebrew school for 8 years, and I even was bar mitzvah and made a speech and all that. And I actually learned to speak a reasonable amount of Hebrew when I was in Hebrew school. I could translate and so on. And that is now essentially completely gone from me. And it's of interest because while I was in high school, which covered some of the years when I was also going to Hebrew school, I graduated from high school at 15, I took 4 years of French in high school. We had a teacher named Mr. Kaplan, who spoke French to us insisted, in any event, the French I learned has stayed with me really even to this day, whereas the Hebrew is completely gone, and was clearly because I hated the Hebrew. I hated the imposition on my life, because my mother insisted on taking me to school. She took me, as I said, when I started going to school, she insisted on taking me to the public school which she worked at, which was about 6 or 7 stations on the New Lots line, IRT New Lots line from where we were. And then I couldn't go home until she was ready to take me home. Then even after that, when I was going to junior high school, 149, my mother insisted that I not go home until she came to pick me up. So I have to sit around or wait around there until she came and picked me up. And the result of that was, first of all, that I was isolated from the kids around the block who just thought I was queer, and they were right. And spending my time going to Hebrew school and so on took up all, there was just nothing left. As a matter of fact, really the only amusement I had was that at a relatively early age I learned to play chess. My father said played cards and he played chess, and he used to play chess with people. And I asked him several times to teach me chess, and he refused to do it. He said it wasn't a good idea. Well, we had a book by Hoyle in the house, which I read. I learned to read at a very early age. And there was a book by Hoyle that described chess, so I learned the moves. And then one day I went to my father. I must have been about 8, 9 years old at this time. I told my father I knew how to play chess and I wanted to play a game with him. So he said, okay, we'll try a game. So we started playing, and about after 3, 4 moves, he realized, he said, well, okay, if we want to play, he said, he has to give me a handicap. So, all right. Now, I don't know how many of you here know chess, but his initial handicap was a queen and 2 rooks.
You gave him a queen?
No, he gave me a handicap.
A queen and 2 rooks?
Yes.
I know that because my brother used to give me that as a handicap.
Yeah. Well, but then we started playing. And after a while, it got to be a queen and a rook. And then it got to be a queen. It stayed at a queen quite a while because it took a queen, they took a certain number of extra moves. And then it finally became a rook. And then eventually, by the time I was 12 or 13, I was playing even. And we continued playing even. And in fact, I was on the chess team in high school, in Thomas Jefferson High School. So there were those influences. I did not have any friends, I would say. When I got to high school, I began to make some friends. There were friends, though, who lived further in the vicinity of Thomas Jefferson High School. So around my neighborhood, I essentially had no friends. I didn't have any particularly, my cousins weren't particularly friendly. And so, friendly with me. And so, in that sense, I was isolated. Now, I say the religion, my mother kept a kosher house. She did various other things. Since we're talking about experiences, I'll put this one down because of a certain amount of unique function for you. My father, I said, was not religious. My mother insisted on keeping this kosher house. Well, on Yom Kippur, my father stayed home from work. My father did not particularly want to fast on Yom Kippur. My mother, who was quite smart, we both my parents were smart, my mother always calculated things. So when we got to Yom Kippur, there was just enough food in the house for me. My mother would say to my father, the child needs to eat. And so my father would just clump around the house, grumping and so on. No place to get him. And if he wanted to buy something, he'd have to go for miles and miles because the whole damn area was closed. And so that's what we always did on Yom Kippur. I was the only one who ate. Didn't make for good relations between me and my father. See, what else did you want to know?
That's enough of the present.
Good.
Well, my experience in our house when during the time that I went to elementary school and high school was very good. High school was interrupted by the fact that my brother suddenly disappeared, but that's another story. But when he was around, my father especially more or less insisted that the whole family be together when we ate, and the family meals were a source of great arguments, many of them political arguments that were started by my father, but the political arguments started by my father was his taking both sides of the issue. And I think the tendency I have to scream when I argue has to do with the background. Anyway, the meals were satisfactory, and my impression is that I had a good time. I enjoyed I was aware of the fact that my father was bringing up arguments, to counteract the arguments that I might hear from other people, and that's the way it was. I mean, it was good. Now, my religious experience, I did not have. My father and my mother kept a kosher house until I started thinking about it, and I started dissuading my parents from being so observant. And I do remember that my father and mother stopped going to synagogue on high holy days, based on the arguments that I gave them. So it must have been while I was probably in high school that I dissuaded them, but it might have been early. I don't know. I don't remember.
Talk about
However,
the your brother.
my father insisted that I go to Hebrew school. Well, he didn't have to insist. I enjoyed going. It was a rather high class Hebrew school, and it was not non-religious, but it was not very religious either. And it did incorporate a lot of things having to do with the sociology of the period which the Jews were being described and so forth. After when I entered high school, and my brother before me also went to a Hebrew high school called Herzliya, and that was on the east side. Well, I know that was important to my family because they actually moved very close to the Williamsburg Bridge so that my brother could go to Herzliya using the shuttle crossing the Williamsburg Bridge. And I followed my brother in this way, and I went to Herzliya, not as long as he did, but the education there was very, very high class. I remember several of the teachers. One of them was a man by the name of Ofer, who used to teach us something about the sociology of the Middle Ages. That's the way I could remember it. We also had a language teacher whose name was Persky, and what I remember most about him was that every time I saw him, he was wearing a different tie. And we would subscribe to a magazine called Hadoah, and the reading assignments were from Hadoah, and it was it was written in Hebrew without vowels, so I must have known a great deal about Hebrew at that time. Though with Ed, it has largely left me. Though when I spent a sabbatical in Israel, I was able to catch on to the language more quickly than Ezzy Edelman, who accompanied me there. So it must have been of some use.
Your
What
brother.
else am I
Talk
supposed
about
to
your brother and the reading a book of the week.
About my brother?
Brother.
Oh, yeah.
Reading a book a
Ruth
week.
does bring up something that was very important in my life. My brother was
The idol of the
He was,
life.
my brother was, well, I thought of him as a genius, and he was very, very smart. Not only smart in the sciences, he actually was a math, he actually went to Columbia for a master's degree, and then shortly thereafter he died.
The fact that your brother never let you have a social life because he would quiz you
Oh, well.
every week on the book that you read that week.
Well, when you finish, tell the story about the books, because then we have...
About what?
Books,
About
about the
the-
books.
about
You
the
told me
books.
too much about your brother, about the books that you had to read every week.
Oh.
And I just...
Yes, they're reminding me. See, my brother's function seemed to have been not to train me in mathematics or science. What he was most worried about was the fact that I would never, once I got into college especially, that I would never read a book. So when I was in, I think either in junior high or the first year of high school, he went to the library with me and he took out a couple of books and he said, I want you to read those before Saturday. And I remember the first one was Dostoevsky's
Possessed.
Brothers Karamazov?
Crime and Punishment.
Crime and Punishment.
And then he used to quiz me about these books. And this went on for years until he ran away. And it wasn't until after he died, I started thinking about how the hell did he know what was in these books? So anyway, that was the kind of background that I had. My father came from a very intellectual background, even though he did not have much of an education, and
Was he
my
born-
mother did not.
What town, what country,
My father's parents lived in Bialystok, which is a fairly big city. However, his father did not live with them except for a few months in the year around Passover. So all the children were born approximately the same time, the same month. My grandfather was he was a grain merchant. What he used to do is buy grain in the Ukraine and sell it in Germany.
They lived in the shtetl. Was that a completely Jewish community?
Well, it's not a, Bialystok may have had, he lived in the shtetl in the sense that it was a neighborhood only of Jews, but it did not have the aura of a shtetl. It was a rather big city, even those days.
All right, thanks. Larry?
Well, let me first talk about my religious background. I think I was an atheist at the age of 7, but nevertheless, my parents were proud of being Jewish, and they thought that I should get some kind of a Jewish education, so they sent me to Hebrew school, which was a complete farce. I learned nothing. I don't think I could say hello in Hebrew. All I knew how to do was read the Bible, and I could read it like a whiz, I mean, like tremendous speed. But whether it meant anything to me or not was irrelevant. My rabbi couldn't have told me where Bronx was, let alone where Israel was. His great claim to fame, as an indication of the kind of education I had, was he'd take a Bible and you open up to any page you like, and he'd touch it, you'd touch a line on there, a word on there, and he would tell you all the words underneath that. In those, imagine that kind of amount of information. So I learned absolutely nothing in going to Hebrew school, and we used to spend our time trying to torture the teacher. But we couldn't torture the rabbi because he'd kid you. He'd hit you with his cane, and that was expected, in fact. So that was a total waste. My parents wanted me to learn Jewish, but they themselves were very marginal on the question of how religion should be faced. And they asked me, please, as long as I lived under their roof, not to eat non-kosher food, even outside. And since they were not very demanding of me in general, I said fine, and I never did. However, they told me, well, you know, we're not quite sure that God exists or doesn't exist. That's for you to decide for yourself. And there's this curious sideline. When I went to graduate school, the first time I ever ate non-kosher food, and I've been sick twice in my life before then, both for very stupid reasons. And so I ate some ham and threw up. And so you can imagine the psychological impact that this has, even if you don't believe a word of it. And so I spent a month learning how to eat non-kosher food. I would take a shrimp this size, put it in a roll that size, and then I finished eating it, I knew I'd had a shrimp. So that was shrimp down the line. Then I learned to eat lobster, etc., etc. So religion played essentially no role in my life. And science played very little. I knew no one who knew what the word science meant. None of my relatives had any science. None of them but one aunt, the youngest of all the sisters and aunts and uncles, only one had a college education, any kind of education. So I didn't know anything about science, and I learned a little bit and not very much in high school, but that one book that I read on physics had this major impact on my life. And it's a curious feature, which is not related to the topic at hand, but it's an indication of how wasted many lives are. When my father was 60, he started going to college. He took more than, of course, the Division of General Education. And he was a man who now was pretty well educated in the world of business. He had certain knowledge of politics, but he started taking courses in science. And he'd come home, and he'd be tremendously excited because he'd look through a microscope and seen little things moving around in the water. And he knew all kinds of things, but the words, the vocabulary, what a neutron was, what a proton was, he had to learn these rudimentary things. So it's an indication of all these wasted lives in which people dedicated them to their children, and they themselves had no chance to do anything until they were very much older. And so
In your case, I don't think it was wasted.
well, they wasted their lives.
Their lives.
No, but they...
Their lives were wasted in a sense. Because if my father had grown up on the different sections, he probably would have been a theoretical physicist or a mathematician or an economist or something. This way he spent his life running around the goddamn subways in New York City, required to wear a jacket, which is one reason I've never worn a jacket, because he used to come home with boils under his arms, because he was not allowed into a building unless he had a jacket on. Didn't have any light jackets.
Sir, what did your father do?
I beg your pardon?
How did your father make a living?
My father went into the garment industry, and since he was smart, he immediately became a cutter, which is, you design the pattern. That's the highest level he got to. And then there was a strike, and my father was not about to become a scab, and my father was not about to let his children starve to death, so he went into the insurance business. And he spent his life selling insurance, which was there's nothing wrong with selling insurance, but he should have been doing something else, but he never had the opportunity. Anyhow, that's my scientific and my religious background.
What about your friends and your social life? Did you have any?
I had a very good social life. I belonged to AZA, which was a Jewish organization. We never discussed anything related to religion, nothing. But we had track meets, we had basketball teams, we had dances of various kinds. I had lots of friends. The only thing I didn't do was study. When I started out in college, if you caught me with a book, I would have been humiliated. I just thought the whole thing was crazy. And until my last year, and then I suddenly realized I'm getting out of college, and I don't have anything. So then I started, and I was behind because I've been studying accounting and wasted my time on that. So I took 5 courses in physics and got 5 A's, and then that was my start of my career.
We'll get into that in a minute. We're not up to college yet.
Yeah,
I
okay.
want to amend
Grace,
something.
Joe Spiro, what happened with that?
Well, this is sort of irrelevant, but it's curious. 5 years ago, almost to the day, I got a call from somebody I had not seen since we were 16 years old. And he'd been living in Florida, and he read about a reunion of New Utrecht High School. And he remembered me. We've been close friends in high school. And he called me, and so I've had a couple of correspondence with a guy that I haven't the slightest notion what he looks like. I remember nothing about him except he was a good athlete and a very nice fellow, and I liked him.
And he named his son after you.
And he named his son after me.
You must have been close to him.
I was close to him in high school, but we never saw him. The war came along. He went and he started flying over the Himalaya as part of the Air Force. So it was a curious event.
Well, okay, so Sidney,
I want to just say something, because I didn't say anything about my social life while I was growing up. I lived in a very, very tough neighborhood in Williamsburg. The center of the neighborhood was a pool room, which was not staffed, but the gangsters used to hang around, and they actually perverted seduced many of the children to do illegal errands for them. So my mother, however, was extremely careful about the people I was thing. As a result of which, I had only one friend by the name of Willie Winekrantz, and the only other friends I had were either in Hebrew school or in.
What about Shirley Lifshitz? Shirley Lifshitz.
Well, Shirley Lifshitz was somebody I hired. He was a fellow student, and he was very good, very brawny, very short but brawny, and he protected me.
Your bodyguard.
You made an exchange.
And the penalty, what I had to contribute was to help him with his homework.
I'd like to just say something about Ed's father. You know, he was a brilliant man.
He was a what?
Really was a brilliant. Eddie's father was.
He was what?
Brilliant.
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 A really brilliant man.
That's right.
And he came, when he came to this country, he had some education. He had some education when he came here. I remember he told me once that his original plan was to bring Chekhov to the American public. But when he was very naive. When he got here, he found that the American public, at least in New York, already knew about Chekhov. And then he got into the garment industry, and he was very quick and very bright. And like your father, he became a cutter and was very good at it and made a lot of money in those days. So, and he never got a further education. And that always, I felt the same way as you did, that his life was, he was so smart, and he could have been he never went to school here. He had so much that always bothered me a great deal.
Well, let me
And he had a wonderful sense of humor, marvelous.
let me say a few words about that, since Jack raised it. I mean, there were some self-destructive features in my father, which his son inherited to some extent. I mean, you know, there are people who are very smart, and things happen. I mean, my father didn't have to spend all his time playing chess and cards. I mean, to some extent, that was a matter of choice. And that's what he did. My mother didn't help. I don't think my father did not have a happy marriage with my mother. My mother was very difficult. As a matter of fact, since we're talking about this, Sid said something about his brother being an influence on him. My brother was a great influence on me. Now, my brother was 11 years younger than I, and he was an influence on me because until I was 10 years old or so, my mother told me that the reason she didn't have another child was because she had so much trouble with me. I was such a rotten kid. And, you know, I got good grades in school. It just came without any difficulty. And it was just sort of assumed. I mean, I do not recall ever being really congratulated for doing well in school. So it was just assumed that I was going to do well in school. And that's really true.
Well, okay. Let's get on to college.
I just want to say one thing, if it's okay, to contrast Larry's father's experience with Sidney's father was that Sidney's father was in a way self-destructive too, because he stayed in the garment industry. He did not get out of it, and there were many strikes, and usually he was out of work during all of these strikes. So instead of knowing how to rescue himself and get out of the garment industry, as Larry's father did, which was to go into insurance and make a living, he never made a living because he was always on strike.
Okay.
I'm not supposed to interrupt. It is remarkable to listen to this really for the first time, my old friends that hear about their past. Their past seem remarkably similar to me.
A lot.
Oh, except that
Their parents all were in the same business. They all had Jewish backgrounds, which didn't take. Well, okay.
No, but if I can comment, there's an enormous difference in the sense that I never remember ever being discouraged about anything. Anything I did was great, and that's the way I grew up. My parents were extremely happily married. My mother died, unfortunately, too early, but my whole life was one in which, so far as I knew, in fact, I must have been 20 years old before I realized that not all parents are happily married.
But one more thing, you say they all have the same background. That's an external effect. There are only a few industries open to Jews and to immigrants. So what else could they do besides go into the garment
Especially
industry?
in coming into New York City.
Okay, all right, now let's move forward in time. You can tell us a little bit about how you got into college, what made you choose the college that you did, as if we didn't know, you didn't have many choices. At what point during the college years, I assume you got interested in physics, and how did you get the idea of going to graduate school?
Starting with me again?
Yeah.
All right. Well, first of all, I went to City College because it was just assumed I would go to college. I mean, as I say, my parents, so this was just taken for granted. As far as whether I would go to City College or anywhere else, actually I tried for a Pulitzer scholarship to Columbia, and I came very close. I mean, I had a very bad experience because I did poorly in the math exam, which I should have done wonderfully, and I got confused in it. But actually, my parents were even talking about trying to send me to Columbia, but when I was interviewed, they told me I would have to go for 2 years. I forget what the school was. At Columbia had a minor league school, and then you went up to in the last time, what was it called again?
Continuing education.
No, it was just the name of the school. Anyway, I didn't want to go there. And I had known in my high school, there were quite a few bright kids who had come from Thomas Jefferson High School. Mort Hammermish was in my class. It was a couple of years ahead of me, a couple of other people, and they had gone to City College. So I decided to go to City College. There wasn't any question about that. Now, when I went to City College had a huge number of required courses, and one of the things you had to take was physics and chemistry and so on. And so I took physics, and as I say, it was my first term there, and Sidney, I trust, remembers that he was actually my lab mate in City College, and the name of the instructor, I believe, was Wolski.
The lab instructor was Walden.
Yeah, the instructor. He was the actual, not just the lab instructor, he was the class instructor. Yeah. And my first experience with him, as a matter of fact, is that the first experiment we had was the force table. And I was sort of fooling around with it, finding out to my surprise you could do this and that. And Wolfie comes along and says, do the experiment you're supposed to do. We had our instructions. And so I said, okay. And then I fooled around some more, and he comes back and he says, Mister, he says, do the experiment. And I said, I got sort of irritated, and I said, well, look, it's my experiment, isn't it? And he says, look, you're going to do it this way, we're going to step outside. Anyway, I was 15 years old at the time. I was about 15 years old at the time, and he was about 6'3" or so it seemed. So I said, I'll do it your way. And as a matter of fact, he was fired or something. He didn't last the year. Something happened to him. But anyway, my first semester of physics, I had a hard time in. It was the first course that I'd had in which I had difficulty. I just did not seem to understand what was going on. I'm convinced it was partly the textbook we had. It was partly this guy, Wolski, I think was that.
Spinny.
Yeah, okay.
Most terrible textbook.
Okay, all right. It may have been, that was the textbook. But anyway, I was so irritated at not being able to do this easily the way I had done everything else, that's really what sort of started my interest in physics. I really began to work on it. As a matter of fact, by the time the second term was over, I was really into it again. I really had done quite well. So that's how I got into physics in that sense. But I was intending to be a math major, not a physics major. And Sidney will remember there were a number of people in City College, a lot of boys who wanted to be math majors. There was a department chair named Reynolds.
Larry Spruch.
You're
being recorded.
Jack, whose go was it?
Who was talking?
I was talking. You want me to continue?
You were talking. Yeah, right.
Yes, I was talking,
Okay.
and I was saying that I'd gotten interested in physics because physics was the first course I'd taken was of any difficulty. But I still liked mathematics, and I still intended to be a math major. And in fact, I actually had a double major at City College. I had a math major and a physics major. I filled the requirements for both. But the chair of the mathematics department at City College, a guy named Reynolds, told me and all the other Jewish boys that we'd never be able to get a job in mathematics, and therefore we better try something else. And that's really why I took that double physics major. Now, as far as going to graduate school is concerned, when I got out of City College, I did not want to go to graduate school. What I wanted was to get a job.
Did the chair, was he an anti-Semite, or was he simply telling you the
No, he
truth?
was an anti-Semite.
He was. Reynolds? was he?
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, in fact, a lot of the faculty in City College were anti-Semitic.
Well, we know
I don't think there was a single Jew in the math department at City College when I was there, except was Post Jewish?
Do you want to talk
Yeah.
about Post? Did you have Post as a teacher?
Yes.
I had Post.
Well,
as
the
a
two of us
teacher,
together, we took the same.
So did I.
I had him in his first class that he gave.
Yeah, I think you and I were in that same
Say a
class.
few words about that.
All right, well, I will in a minute. Let me just finish what I was saying. So, I did not intend to go to graduate school. I just wanted to get out of the house. I could not stand it. And I spent essentially a year, half a year, trying to get a job. I tried all over. First, my innocence, I went down to Bell Labs and tried to get a job with them.
Oh.
And then I ended up at the end trying to get jobs. Trying to get a job anywhere, any ad. I remember once trying to answering an ad for something in Macy's, and the whole damn street was full. 34th
Ed, let
Street.
me interrupt. Remind the listeners, this was about approximately
Yeah,
what,
this was
1938?
This was 1937. This was 1937, 38.
Was not a good time.
No, it wasn't a hard. Well, in fact, the entire depression. All the time was in college was the depression, and all the time was in college. You'd see the subways, which subway was a nickel. The subways full of people who were obviously homeless and had no clothes, riding back and forth in the wintertime because that was the only way to keep warm. There's no doubt about that. I'm sort of leaving that out. But anyway, it was only after a half year or so of this that I just gave up and decided to try to go back to graduate school. And a good friend of mine in college, whom I met in college, named Leo Saperstein, was not in mathematics, he was in biology. He, the year before, had gone to Berkeley, was there. And as was mentioned earlier, Hank Gilbarg, who was David Gilbarg's brother, was at Berkeley. And I had asked a man named Mark Zemansky, who was the major professor whom I liked in City College, where I should go to graduate school. He suggested going to Berkeley and working with Oppenheimer. So for those reasons is why I went to Berkeley. And in fact, my parents, they got together the money for me to go to Berkeley, and the first term, I applied for assistantship but didn't get it. When I went out to Berkeley, Burge had told me not to come. He was the chair, and there I was. And he said, took pity on me, and he gave me NYA. And then after one term, I was getting $40 a month, and I've told this. And after a term, I got a teaching assistantship, and my salary went up to $65 a month. And I was so rich, I bought a car.
That's right. Can I interrupt and ask something?
Yeah.
You said there were no Jews in City College.
I said no Jews in the
No, no,
faculty.
Jews in math
In the
department.
math faculty.
Oh, just math.
Yeah,
Because
math.
Zemansky was.
No,
No,
not in
CMAT was also Jewish.
Yeah, no, there were a lot of, but not in the math faculty. All right, so that was the story there. Now you wanted me to say a word about it.
Post, yes.
Yeah. There were various courses given, and there was a course in functions with real variable. And so we registered for it, and Sidney and I registered at the same time. We went to the class. We didn't know who was giving it. In walks this guy with one arm, and he had assigned a textbook. The textbook was a book by Townsend, as I remember it, and it was functions of a real variable. And so he assigned, the first assignment, he assigned this thing, and I went home and read it. And I said, Jesus, it was marvelous. I never before realized the beauty and the rigor of real variable theory and so on. Then we came to class the next day, and he just tore it apart. I mean, he just destroyed all this rigor and so on. And that's how it was. He had a mind that was just marvelous. He really understood real variable. I loved that course. It was just a great, great course. And he was a great guy, and he had come to City College from high school. He'd been a high school teacher because he had not been able to get any other kind of a job. And he'd done some work in symbolic logic. He did a very important theorem in symbolic logic, and I guess that's what got him the job at City College.
Do you remember his making the kids go to the blackboard to solve it, do the homework every day? Did he make you do that?
Yeah, but that was done by a lot of people there. It was not unique by any means. And I think actually there was less of that. It was hard to get problems in real bear you could do on the blackboard.
Oh, yes, I remember being sent to the board with him and to prove Bolzano's theorem, things like that.
Yeah. Well, when did you have him?
I had when I was going to City College, which was therefore around 1940, 1941.
This was 1936, I
This is
think.
about 1936, 36 would be right.
That was the first
He
course
was
that he gave.
maybe the best teacher I think I ever had in my life.
Well, I would not say that, because the person whom I really loved and so on was Morris Raphael Cohen. I took
I never
Morris
had-
Raphael Cohen.
And I never,
Yeah, and I took his
unfortunately,
courses,
he was
and I
gone.
love. You
And he
love
was
it.
philosophy.
Yes.
I missed him
Uh-huh.
because he was already gone.
Yeah. I remember one whole lecture we had on how does a female giraffe know that she's a female giraffe and not a male giraffe.
How?
We never got it straight. I can't remember.
What's the answer?
But then years later, I became good friends with his son.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
Bill.
Oh, Bill.
Bill Cohen. He also had another son.
They had Victor Cohen.
Well,
What's this?
that's the same.
Oh, that's Victor. Oh, I see. Yes.
Well, Sidney,
Well, first I have to tell you about the revenge on Reynolds. I took a course, I don't remember what the name of the course was. Schwingel, by the way, was our classmate before he went to Columbia.
Before he went to Columbia.
And he was in the same class with Reynolds, with, I don't think Ed was in that class.
No, I was not in that
matter of
class. I was not in
no,
that class.
you weren't. But what happened is that one of the things that Reynolds did is he used to assign homework, and then he would assign people to do the homework on the board, and he'd mark them, so forth and so on. But Schwinger didn't come to class very often, so whenever he did come, Reynolds
What do you
used
mean
to
very
call on
often?
him.
Schwinger hardly ever came to class.
But whenever he did come, Reynolds used to call on him. So, as usual, Schwinger would start solving the problem, starting with basics. And this would absolutely drive Reynolds off the wall. First of all, he didn't understand most of what Schwinger was saying, and then he was afraid to say it. So anyway, he gave Schwinger short shrift in the end. However, in a way, it was a kind of revenge on him that a Jewish boy should do it to him.
It was algebraic geometry, I think. Wasn't the course algebraic geometry?
I don't remember.
I think that's what it was.
Anyway, I also I did not have the misgivings that Ed had. Even I hadn't taken physics in high school because my brother told me that it was absolutely a waste. He said, "You'll never get a teacher that knows anything." And so I started in with college the same way that Ed did. And however, everything was easy for me in physics. It was also easy for me in mathematics. In short, it was easy for me. That's about all I can remember about my college years.
Why did you become a physics major in the first place?
Well, because I did well, and as Ed pointed out, math majors weren't very much sought after at City College for people like me. I'll talk about this later, I think that was one of the reasons that I became a physics major, I now remember, was I felt that if I were going to study math, I would somehow or other be in competition with my brother, and I didn't think that was a fair competition for me, so I studied something that was close to it. But there were other reasons. The other reasons were, just as Ed mentioned, that we weren't very well regarded. Also, Zemansky had a big influence. I think he had a big influence on all the Jewish students who were there. He was the first
Mensch.
teacher that we had who really was a high class. He had actually some great honors before he came to City College. He ended up at City College because in those days there was very little else that would be available for a man like him. Should I say anything else?
Certainly, if you wish.
I don't know.
Well, with the courses you took at City College, apart from Zemansky, you took, I assume
I
you
took the course of
thermodynamics,
Zemansky.
mechanics.
Oh, I took one course that was absolutely devastating. It absolutely killed me. And that was a course with a man by the name of Marcus.
Oh, yeah,
electricity and
the lab course.
No, this is not the lab course.
No.
It was a regular course.
No, Marcus,
regular course.
Marcus was the lab instructor.
Well, I don't know what he was when you were there. He was absolutely an idiot.
Yes.
That's what he is.
Well, not only that, we used his textbook.
Yes.
And he gave me all the wrong ideas about it. It affected me greatly in my study of physics. E&M actually came very difficult for me after that.
Did you ever have a physics instructor called Taylor?
No.
Not the
Oh,
master.
I know about him.
You know about
He
him.
was even worse.
He was a master anti-Semite.
Let me say a word. The instruction that I had at City College was by and large not very good. There were a few outstanding professors. There was Zemansky. He was just about the only physics instructor I had who was really any good. We had CMAT, who had written a book on modern physics, and we used his book, and he was competent, but he wasn't really very good.
He was a graduate student at that time.
Was he still a graduate?
Yes,
No.
and Schwinger used to help him with his work.
Well, are you sure? Because CMAT... No, come on, you have the wrong... No,
Talking about
that's...
Seaman or Zemansky?
No, CMAT.
No, CMAT.
He's wrong. Believe me, he's wrong. He's forgotten. But anyway, what I was going to say was that there was some of the instruction was so terrible. Sidney will remember that after this guy Wolski left, we had a man, and I think his name Rose. Who was the big fat rich player?
Oh, sure.
Shaw, that's right. And Shaw was, and he would put problems on. He would give us put a problem, and he'd say to show us how to do it, and he'd start doing the problem, and then he'd pull out his book. He had a little answer book, and he'd pull out this answer book, and he'd pull out this book, and he'd look at the board, and he'd hardy it, and then he'd erase the whole board and start all over again. Remember that, Sidney? He did that all the time.
Well, okay, I think now we're going to cross the river
Get a job.
to Brooklyn.
Oh,
No, but if you want to know how I became a physicist, I have to tell you what happened at City College.
Yeah.
I did go to City College.
Yeah.
Oh, you did, Lanzmann.
No, I went downtown, I went here.
Oh, downtown. Oh, all right, go ahead.
On
Go ahead,
23rd
tell your
Street.
story your own way.
That's right.
Oh, that was.
Because I've
You were
been told
accounting.
I couldn't make a living in physics, so I went into accounting. So I took a course in physics after a while, and the physics teacher wanted to see how much mathematics we knew, so he gave a quiz. And you were allowed, whatever it was, an hour and a half for the quiz. So I sat down, I wrote down the answers, and in 5 minutes I got up and I left. I mean, the hardest question on the quiz was, you have two linear equations with simple coefficients, what's the answer? That's the hardest question. And most of the kids in that class couldn't come close. So he took me aside. Another case of being an idiot, I never thanked him. He said, "What are you doing here?" he asked me. But nevertheless, I didn't know what to do. So I sat in this accounting class, and I'm the only person I know who knows to within 1/1,000,000th of a second when he became a physicist. He was teaching us that assets minus liabilities are equal to proprietorship. A minus L equals P. And I was sitting in the class wearing shorts because I'd just come from wrestling and I had a jersey on, I didn't have a shirt on. And he says, you're all out of high school now. You have to look at things in different ways. You mustn't only say A minus L equals P, you can also say A equals L plus P. I got up, I walked out, I went to the registrar, and I said, how do I leave? And that had a very, very big impact on my life. Because until I got to MIT, I never met anybody that was out of my class in physics. There were guys that were comparable, maybe they were a little better, maybe a little worse. Mostly I was one of the best students and had fellowships and so forth. But there was nobody really that much better than I was. And then I went to MIT, and among other people I met there was Murray Gell-Mann.
Was that
But
in graduate school or in graduate?
I was in graduate school.
Oh,
He was an undergraduate.
Oh, he was an undergraduate.
No, I'm sorry. He was a graduate school, and I was a postdoc when I went to I'm sorry. So then I knew that, this is a different world. And nevertheless, I was first of all old enough so it didn't kill me. And secondly, the experience I had as an accountant was terrific. Because I would say to myself, what the hell am I doing in this field with this guy like this around? I mean, it's crazy for me to be in physics. Then I'd say, I could have been an accountant, and I'd be so happy. So it was a wonderful experience. But when I went to City College, when I switched over to Brooklyn, I was behind because I'd spent a year and a half. So, for example, I never in my life had a course on a function of real variables. I never in my life had a course on complex variables and so forth and so on. I learned a little bit as I went along, but it had a major impact on the kind of stuff I did in physics. And in fact, I never did any mathematical stuff until the last few years when I started working with a postdoc whose primary emphasis is on mathematics. So my whole career was a little different because I had a different outlook than most theorists. I didn't write down the equations right away. I used to sit and think about what the implications, because I couldn't do the mathematics as well as most of the theorists. So it had a major impact on me. So my career in physics was kind of well defined in terms of particular incidents. But it really is true that I didn't have the slightest idea of what a scientist was until I was about, 16 or 17. Also, when I think back on my education, I remember in high school, they started talking about writing an article that would be the kind of thing that appeared in a national magazine. I remember I was about 15 years old, and I didn't know what a national magazine was. I didn't know there were magazines that were distributed all over the country.
Playboy.
No, Playboy didn't
No,
exist in those days.
There was no Playboy.
Now, the fact of the matter is that the difference in my age and your ages made an enormous impact on the possibility of getting a job. When you were getting through, there was no possibility.
Yes.
When I was getting through, there was a minimal possibility. But there was a small possibility, and that made an enormous difference. You, for example, I should point, Sid, for example, had to do other things for a few years, and I was lucky enough that when I got out, I could get a job. But getting into graduate school had all kinds of elements of luck, which had tremendous impact on my life. I applied to graduate school, and I got accepted by University of Pennsylvania. And the next day, I got accepted by Harvard. So I went to Carl Meyer, who was the professor, and I didn't know any better. And I said to Carl Meyer, is it possible for me, the day after I accepted, to switch and say I want to go to Harvard? Carl Meyer was imperturbable. You never saw emotion on his face. I could see the light in his eye. I thought he was going to kill me. The point was that very few students from Brooklyn College could get into an Ivy College. And now I got into the Ivy College. There had been one or two, I think, before me. And if I suddenly switched and said I wasn't going to go there, it would have been the end of the possibility of anybody from Brooklyn College going to Penn. So I never even discussed it for another second. I just saw the look on his face. And then, of course, I met Grace when I went to Penn. If Lawrence had been switched a day earlier, God knows whom I'd be whom I'd be married to. So it's a very weird situation. Everybody plans their lives And there's no planning. I mean, you can't plan your
That's
life.
the road not taken.
The road not taken yet.
Excuse me, Larry, you were also given the opportunity to go to Harvard?
He didn't go to Harvard.
I didn't go.
He was given the opportunity, he was
went to
accepted, he
Penn.
was
Accepted
accepted.
I
at
went to-
Harvard and University of Pennsylvania?
No, I accepted the job at Pennsylvania.
Uh-huh.
Then I got the next day, I got acceptance to Harvard, but I didn't go because I couldn't turn down Penn. So I never went to Harvard, and in fact, Harvard
Did you think
abolished its
Harvard was
graduate
better?
school during the war.
Wasn't Harvard more prestigious? Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
It was,
Harvard was more prestigious.
Oh, yeah, which is why, to me, what did I know? Getting into college, if you ask me why I went to City College, I mean, there was absolutely no possibility. The only possibility was to go to a city school, city university. And it infuriates me that there's a tuition that's charged now for the city university. It's true that it's not an enormous amount of money. It's true that they give you some help, but the fact remains that there's a psychological damage done. If you need the help, you should be able to go if you have any ability. And all of a sudden, in this rich country of ours, we can't have the city university as free. And on those occasions, when I go to City University, any of the colleges, City University, I've ever given a lecture, I start off with an unfriendly remark about how it's disgusting that they're charging tuition here.
It's the same over in California, you know, it used to be
Yeah,
absolutely
it's all,
free.
yeah.
Well,
California
it is
worse.
true that all three of you, when all three of you went to college, it was free, except for lab fees, which were not insubstantial.
Do you know when we were in the city college, our textbooks were free?
Oh, really?
We didn't pay for textbooks.
Oh, I had to pay for
I had to pay taxes.
Well, maybe you did, but
I
when we were
had
there,
to sell them.
we didn't.
Oh, yeah, we had a whole,
Well, I'm just telling you, things change. And to get back to this, I mean, that was in the time of the Depression. I mean, what Larry was saying, it is disgraceful. Somehow or other, the city of New York in those days could find the money to send its good students to school, not charge them anything. And then when the heart of a prosperity and so on, I mean, we no longer are doing this for anybody.
That's fantastic.
Okay, so let's go on now. I'd like you to talk about graduate school, and say at the same time, of course, you're beginning to lead real lives now. By now, you at some point you met women who turned out to be your lifelong companions, all three of you. And I'd like you to say a few words about that, and how you how you went on from there. What happened to you during the war? And say a few words about how you spent your years during World War II. So that's a long, big job for you, Ed.
Well, as I've said, I got to graduate school. I started taking courses there. And I was certainly a theorist, and Oppenheimer was the only real theorist there. In any event, at that time, that was the only, if I wanted to learn modern physics.
say the year,
I got to graduate school in 1938. I graduated in 1937 from City College. I spent the year, as I said, trying to find something. And I got to Berkeley in 1938, in August 1938. And I immediately started taking courses. I mean, I took a course from Oppenheimer my first term there. That was, he gave an elementary quantum mechanics course. And then I took other courses from him. And I eventually, as I asked him if I would be a student of his, and he said, we'll see what you can do. As it turned out, I did not work that much with Oppenheimer. The problems I did for my PhD all seemed to flow aside from other places. There were experimentalists were writing to Oppenheimer or talking to him. And my first problem was a problem that someone was doing some experiments and they'd gotten some anomalous results. And Oppenheimer asked me to look at it, and then he told me to work with Schiff, and so I worked out. The anomalous results were understandable, and so it went. I don't think this is a place somehow to really go into details about my PhD work. But what I will say is this. I did not work with Oppenheimer as much as most of the students. I was not personally with him. But there were various reasons, and I'll take this opportunity here to say I did not speak earlier about my political education. I mean, I had an uncle who was an out-and-out communist. His name was Benjamin Gerjuoy. He's now dead, and he was actually an organizer for the Communist Party, mainly in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, among mine workers and so on. And my father was certainly radical, although he did not take any active part in politics. In City College, I was surrounded by all kinds of radical people, and Sidney and I know. And so when I went to City College, when I went to Berkeley, I had sort of decided to put that behind me. And I felt that Oppenheimer was rather naive in his politics. I didn't think that he sort of was understood things. And I've learned some things since that he never, that his first election he worked in, actually voted in was 1936. So anybody who calls Oppenheimer a communist doesn't understand what communists were like in those days. They voted in every election, if possible, twice. Now, and at City College, there were various elections at City College I know about, and I know very definitely of elections at City College in which the students hung around and wasted time until finally everybody else went home, and then the Communist Party of people on the socialist zone, they were the only ones left, and they sort of divide up the votes. So to be
Well,
sure.
excuse me, you mean voting on college,
And college.
a university?
Yes, that's right.
No,
Yeah.
not the
No, not the
national.
national. They didn't have anything to do there. But I say you voted as many times as you could, whenever you had a chance
In
to.
university affairs.
That's right, yeah. Anyway, so during the war, about a year before the war began, I would say, Oppenheimer began working on work which eventually later became the Manhattan Project, and various students of his, he asked them to do some classified work, and they were disappearing behind the top floor of the Contour where they had a guard. And he asked me to work in it, and I was not interested in doing that kind of work. And as a result, what happened was that when December 7th, 1941 came along, and I went in the next day to see and Oppie saw me, he said, "You've done enough work for your PhD." And 2 weeks later, I had a PhD. Essentially, I had a perfunctory oral. I put together the papers I'd written and had my PhD. But then Burge called me in and told me that my draft board, which had deferred me all those years, would no longer want to defer me what I was going to do. And when I spoke to Oppenheimer, he did not seem to want to give me a job, didn't like my attitude. And so I ended up actually scraping, and I found a job in Underwater Sound at New London,
You
Connecticut.
found a job doing what?
Underwater Sound. I found a job working on undersea warfare. I mean,
Empire State.
Yeah, I remember.
no, this was actually at New London, Connecticut.
New London, that's-
In New London, Connecticut, where I spent the first 2 years. And I was there just going crazy. What had happened was that I'd gone out there, and I was not yet cleared. And before I could get cleared, well, they had a barge there, and that barge was measuring the responses of various kinds of underwater hydrophones and transducers and so on. That was one of the things they were doing there, is that kind of research. And so this was regarded as not very important. And so before you could get cleared, you were sort of put to work there doing things. So I put me on this barge one day, and the results from these experimental things on hydrophone were just terrible. I mean, you'd measure them one day and get one result, and you measure them the next day, they'd vary by 10 dB, which those of you who know means actually a factor of 10. I mean, it was ridiculous. And so I just made an innocent remark. I said, well, gee, it's no wonder. I said, you've got this barge tied up against the pier here, and the water is so short. The water is not very deep, and the wavelength of sound in water is very, very large. You better take them out in the middle of the river, and then you'll get much better results. So sure enough, the director heard about this, and he took it out in the middle of the river, and the errors went down from 10 dB to about 1.5 dB. And he said, "You're going to be the director of the barge." And so for the rest of my time in New London, I was a guy doing these measurements, and it was just driving me crazy. I was just the dullest thing imaginable. But I finally started doing calculations on my own, because I got so bored essentially on tactics and what you would call operational analysis. And this came to the attention of Lyman. These things came to the attention of Lyman Spitzer, who was at the Empire State Building. And Lyman called me and asked me if I wanted to come to work for him. And that's how I ended up in Lyman and so on. That's with my war years. And then actually I got to be such an expert I got to be a real expert at it. My last year, a little more than my last year, I went down and I was a liaison between the sonar analysis group and the Navy, the undersea warfare code 18, I forget what the number was, but I was the guy who was supposed to be talking to submarine commanders about using their transducers and so on. And I went down and gave a talk, for instance, I remember, in Pensacola or something like that, talking to the submarine commanders about things like this. So that's what I did during the war. And that is enough.
Well, between the first and second year that Ed was at the University of California, he came to visit me during the summer. I had gotten out of college and I was determined to go to graduate school, but the family was in very serious financial straits, as they usually were, and Ed mentioned, or I mentioned, that my brother actually was working for my cousin, so my cousin hired me as an assistant for my brother half-time. And at that time, New York University had a graduate program at night, so I worked during the day and I went to this graduate program at night. And I actually had two good courses. I had one course in dynamics with Lowen, and I had one course with, what was that guy's name? At E&M.
Quimby. Quimby?
No, Quincy
No,
Columbia.
That was Columbia. Oh, yeah.
Graduate school. His name began with a K. Anyway, he was actually a distinguished man, and finally left NYU and got a good job in some Midwestern school. But anyway, Ed came to visit me and he said, "What the hell are you doing at NYU? Why don't you come out to Berkeley?" So I wrote to Burge, and Burge gave me the same answer he gave Ed. He says, "Please don't come." I was born very close to where you live in Brooklyn. That was his answer. So Ed and I went out there, and I appeared in Burge's office, and he said, "I told you not to come." And I said, "Well, here I am." So he gave me a readership in the physics department, which didn't pay very much. I think it paid $20 or $25 a month. And but he said, "I'll get you a readership in the math department," which he did, and that's the way it started. And then I registered then to the University of California. Ed said that I started taking a course with Oppie, but I don't remember that. I took two courses that I didn't remember. One was a dynamics course with Lenzen, and the other was an E&M course with Lawrence. But as I told Ed, even today, His Majesty seldom showed up. But that's not the important part of the story. In the middle of the first semester, I got a call from New York saying that my brother was seriously ill with leukemia, and that my father lost his job and I better come home. So the first problem I had was how to get home, because I had no money and they had no money. But then they remembered this cousin that I was telling you about that had employed my brother, and he had an office in San Francisco. So he instructed me to go down to this office and take out $500 and go home. So I went home. And then it was also clear to me that I could go back to graduate school. And I went to this cousin and told him that I was quitting graduate school and I took a job. I actually took a civil service job.
Your brother had died by this time.
Huh?
Your brother had died by this time?
He was dying, and then he died. Didn't take long to kill him. Anyway, I went to this cousin of mine, and he said, "Don't quit school." He said, "I'll support you until your PhD degree if you want to."
This is
And I
one in
said I
California?
didn't have enough confidence in myself to
He had an office.
be a financial burden to him, and I better work this out myself. So he said, "Okay." And then I started working seriously. During the war, I worked for Western Electric Company, and I started as a engineer trainee, but by the time, in just a year, less than a year, I became a section head in engineering, and the engineering that I did was industrial engineering. I used to set up assembly lines at Western Electric Company, and it was moderately interesting because the job I really had was I would go to Bell Laboratories, the West Street, and spend a few months there looking over the sheets,
The blueprints.
the things where they describe the products that are going to be made.
Yeah.
And then as a result of that, I had to decide how the thing is to be put together and so forth. So it's moderately interesting on that point. However, VJ Day, I quit Western Electric Company because the draft was not such an important thing. And I got a job around here with a man by the name of Neuwirth. And this guy was making photographic products. And then one day he called me in. He said, "I want you to look up this and this company and tell me how he's rated." So I said, "Why do you want to know how he's rated?" He says, "Well, I look up at this guy. He's got a new patent, and if he's rated better than I am, I won't make the product. But if he's rated worse than I am," he says, I'll infringe the product." So, in a short while, I quit this guy, and then after that, I decided that I didn't want to work for anybody else, so I decided I was going to go into business. And I was a friend of somebody by the name of Morris Sorkin, and he was starting a business with another guy, and they took me in, and the only thing, I did get one patent out of this business, a photographic viewer, and then I decided I didn't want to, this was too risky a business, and then I started a company called, what was the name of the company? I raised $6,000, and I started a company
Public
called...
Domain, that was the one, Public Domain in the printing company?
and not a printing, it was a magazine that I was putting out.
Public Domain, that was...
Public Domain.
That's right.
And the idea there was to take patents which were expiring, and the idea was that there were a lot of machine shops which had to which didn't have any war work, but they had a lot of machinery. Maybe they would pick up a patent that expired. And so we published this magazine, and you don't want to know the ins and outs of this thing, but I was...
Of expired patents.
Yes, it's about expiring patents, yes. That's another story, how you get expiring patents, but that's...
At what point in all of this did you get married?
And then some company wanted to sue me because even though my lawyer had told me it's perfectly all right, what I had used is I had used some income from the subscriptions I had to try to get more subscriptions. And then there was some complaints about that, and I got a government thing and so I decided, oh, the hell with it. And I was walking along some street in the Bronx, and I saw Morty Hammermesh.
You just bumped into him.
Huh? I just bumped into him.
Cedar Avenue.
And I said, how are you, Morty? Morty was a friend of my brother's, so we knew each other. And he said, what are you doing? I said, not very well. And then I described my situation, and he said, what the hell are you doing there? You should go to graduate school, get your degree. Well, I had the previous year, I had sent out, I think, 40 requests to get an assistantship. By this time, I was married, and I had some family responsibilities. So I sent out about 40 of these, and I got one answer from the University of Oklahoma rejecting me. So I told all this to Morty, and he said, listen, we need an instructor of physics at NYU. Why don't you call Joe Boyce? I'll talk to him. So I called Joe Boyce, and I had a meeting with him at the Harvard Club, and he hired me right then and there. And the deal was that I was to teach 4 courses, and then my graduate school would be for free. And by this time I had a master's degree, because when I was working in Washington, I went to graduate school at George Washington University, and I took a couple of courses, one with Teller and one with
Gamow.
What's his name?
Gamow?
Gamow, that's right. And so I had the master's degree, and anyway, so he hired me, and I think I got my PhD degree in 1 more year.
It took you 2 years from the time. It was 2 years from the time you enrolled after you met me.
Well, I don't remember. Maybe it was 1 year or 2 years.
Who was your thesis?
Two
But
years.
anyway, and then after I got my degree, I must say that through Morty's influence, I got a position as the research assistant for Julian Schwinger.
No, that was, you got an instructorship. You became an instructor first.
Well, I was instructor there, but that was, I think I only taught 1 course there, as a matter of fact.
Sidney, now when did you get your PhD? What year?
48, was it 47?
It was,
47.
no, not 38. It was
47.
46 or 47.
46 or 47. And Mort was your advisor.
Morth was my advisor, and it was a stinking PhD thesis. I think the only one who read it was what was the name of this guy at NYU, whom everybody...
Korf?
Huh?
Korf?
Oh, no, a very high-class theoretician, and he wrote a rebuttal in the New York... the whole thing was an embarrassment to me.
Oh, really?
Anyway, it doesn't make any difference, but I ended up with Schwinger, and that's just another story that I have to tell, because that something important happened there.
Well, okay, thank you, Larry.
But I think that's interesting that both Schwinger was a big influence on Ed, on Eddie, and on you too, on the...
Well, we both knew Schwinger
Yeah,
slightly
from before,
in
I know,
college,
from
that's
City
right.
College, but from opposite sides of the country, but you worked with Schwinger and then...
Yeah, but Julian wasn't an influence on me in that sense. I worked with him. I knew what Julian, I knew how good Julian was already when I was in City College.
Yeah. Ed, Larry?
Well, my career was quite simple compared to my 2 friends here, largely because I'm a few years younger, and I never have been outside of academia. My career in graduate school, my education in graduate school was very similar to that in high school and in college. In high school, I had that mad Russian who taught me almost everything I learned in high school. In college, I had a reader who taught terrible courses, but you learned tremendous amounts. Then he gave an exam one time, and I don't want to give a long discussion, but roughly speaking, he looks around this class of students, of whom half are going to end up at university professors, and every one of them is flunking because he gave an incredible exam. So finally he looks around and he says, okay, he says, okay, he says, cheat. Cheat. But it was a very good class. I learned all kinds of things. And then I went to graduate school, and most of my learning there was with Leonard Schiff. And I was very clever in choosing my parents. I've also been very clever in choosing all the people along the line, because Schiff was a wonderful man. In graduate school, in postdoc, I worked with Weizsäcker, who was a wonderful man. And then I spent a year at Oxford with Piles, who was a wonderful man. I have no complaints about anything. I'm not, on the contrary, I'm very happy with all these arrangements. Now, when I worked for Schiff, he was the chair. But in those days, Pennsylvania had a very miserable little building for physics.
Excuse me. When was that before he went to Stanford?
Yes.
No,
Yes.
okay.
Ed,
Yes,
I mean, incidentally, you were involved with Schiff.
Oh,
at some
very
point,
much.
too.
Very
Isn't that
much.
interesting?
Schiff was
so
a-
you in a certain sense, you interacted through Schiff at some point.
Well, if you want, there was 1 degree of separation in this case.
Yeah, 1 degree of separation.
Well, Schiff had an office where he was the chair, and he had an office where he did research. But there weren't enough offices, so I shared an office with Schiff. And my experience was, first of all, he taught a very good class, a course. Secondly, he was teaching a course in quantum mechanics, which was essentially, so far as I know, the set of notes had started with Oppenheimer.
That's right.
But my experience there was, firstly, the courses were very good, and secondly, he asked me to go over the book. He was publishing a book. There were 13 chapters, and I did 9 of the chapters. And when I say I did them, I mean every line in those 9 chapters I went over, and if there's anything I didn't know, he would rewrite it. And he would take me out for dinner after each chapter was over, and since I had no money to eat practically, that was a really big treat. But the amount of learning, it was like having a tutor at the highest level. So it was really great. And then I started doing my research, and we were doing some calculations. Firstly, I did 1 or 2 little things with Schiff, and it was quite exciting that he gave me something to do, and he'd already written some notes, and I found a little mistake in it. He forgot to take the reduced mass into account. It was a minor, trivial thing, but the idea that I'd made a contribution to science in this little trivial way was tremendously exciting. It was the first thing I ever did that was of any relevance of any kind. It turned out, it was a very important problem, but it turned out somebody else did it first. And then I did something else with Schiff, and then he got a little nervous, and he checked, and he sent them to Beta, and Beta said that Lord Rayleigh did that. And at that stage I learned that before you publish a paper, there are a few people you check on. One is Lord Rayleigh.
Because he did everything.
He did everything.
Lord Rayleigh.
Lord Rayleigh. He was an English physicist who was my biggest physics hero. And so I did this thesis with Schiff, and then he got the offer to go to Stanford as the chair. And he asked me would I like to come. And I figured, what the hell? I've already passed my prelims. I'm most of the way through my thesis. So why should I go out there? I'll just finish up here. And Schiff was very nice. He made absolutely certain that I understood the problem well enough to finish. Unfortunately, the computer got into existence at that time. At MIT, they started doing the same calculation with the computer. So I got wiped out. There were no theorists at Penn that knew anything. So I picked a topic on my own. I did beta decay. And I worked on it for a while. Nobody advised me. I had an official advisor whom I didn't talk to. He made no pretense that he understood anything. At a certain moment I said, what's the point of all this? I could write a really good thesis maybe if I spend another year at it, but I'll be all alone, on my own, for a year, not having anybody to sort of help me along. I said, I don't need it. So I went into the chair's office and I said, this is my thesis, I approve of it. And he said, fine. And they gave me the thesis, and I went up to MIT where I worked with Weizsäcker. And working with Weisskopf was a very, very nice experience. He had around him some very good physicists. All were postdocs except one, that was Murray Gell-Mann. And one day a week, we would go out for dinner together. And you were not allowed to talk physics. And then after dinner, we'd come back to the university, and we would do physics, but you weren't allowed to talk about anything you understood. You could only talk about things you didn't know. And anybody listening to that conversation with 7 postdocs, Murray Gell-Mann and Weisskopf, would have concluded that the most stupid person in the room was Weisskopf. Whatever the subject was, he would ask questions. They were dumb questions. I mean, we understood this. The only thing we didn't understand was the answer. And they would ask the same question and modify it and try a different direction. It was boring. And then always the same damn thing happened. He got the answer. I never to this day understood it, how it went on in his head. But he was very intuitive and very, very smart and very, very nice and a joy to be with in every possible way. Socially, in every possible way, he was a great man. And so I had a very nice experience in graduate school. And then the question came of getting a job. I should say, by the way, why I wasn't in the Army. I had a bad back, and I went to the Army, and I said, I'd like to join the Army, but I cannot go through training. I'll get murdered. I mean, I cannot, my back will not take it. So the guy started cursing me. He said, I'm a coward, I'm this and that and the other thing. So I said, what am I going to do? I can't carry on a sensible conversation with this man. So I went and I had a medical exam, and I never did find out if it was true, but they told me I had Shalaman's disease. I don't know what that is. It was some disease of the spinal column. It was one of the first x-rays that was capable of showing it. I doubt that I ever had it, but in any event, I didn't get into the Army. So then when I got out of MIT, Weisskopf arranged for 2 jobs. One was at Notre Dame and one was at NYU. NYU at that time was a pretty crummy place. Notre Dame, I believe, was a little better, but I didn't exactly want to work at a place where there were going to be Jesuses all over the room. It didn't suit my lifestyle. But more than that, that was not really what bothered me. What really bothered me was being outside of New York. I'm really a New Yorker. So, and it would have been easier for Grace to adjust if we went there rather than for her to go out to Notre Dame with me, because we were already, by the time the job situation came along, we were already married. So I took the job at NYU, and there my career was changed very much by a gentleman in the room, because I was trained as a nuclear physicist, but there was no nuclear physics at NYU, but there was a lot of atomic physics at NYU. And so I worked on some of the topics that Ben was involved with, which had a very important impact on what exactly I was doing. And so I became an atomic physicist. Then I switched out and started doing some other things. But for the first few years at NYU, that was my main thing, was atomic physics, trying to explain some of the experiments that Ben had been involved with.
Have about 5 minutes on this tape, I think.
Yeah, tape is almost finished, but we're going to go through, we have one more tape. Would you like to now finish, not finish, I mean, Ed had several other careers, and
I would like to say
Sidney's had
something very
other
much.
careers. Larry has kept one career going, but his interests have changed. So I think I would like to have each of you give a summary of what's happened since those early days.
Well, very briefly, first of all, my first academic job was at the University of Southern California. And I should say that I, in all seriousness, became quite an expert. And that at the end of the war, I was offered a job to remain as a specialist working with the Navy in underwater sound at about a salary of about $8,500 a year, which was just an incredible salary in those days. But I just did not want to do it. I was sick and tired of war work. I never liked that kind of work. I did it, but I was worse being in the Army, but I didn't want to do it, and so I took a job at USC for $3,600 a year as an assistant professor. I started USC I started there in 1946. By 1951, I'd already been promoted to associate professor. A huge conflict broke out in the department, which I was peripherally involved in, which I was so sick of it. I got invited by Sidney and Leon Fisher to come to NYU for a year, which I did, and spent a year there. And then I did not get a job at NYU, which I would have liked to have. It's Sidney's fault because he couldn't push it through. And so then I left and went back. I was going to go back to USC, but I stopped off in Pittsburgh on the way to work at Westinghouse because I needed the money. And then the contract I expected from USC didn't come through. I gave them the talk at Pitt, and they offered me a job, and that's stayed at Pitt. I spent 6 years in industry for a complicated reason. Again, it's also complicated. And then I came back to Pittsburgh, where I've been since 1964. However, in 1975, I decided I had been working in atomic physics theory the way Larry has been. And by 1975, I decided that my days as an atomic theorist were over because computers were coming in and the problems you could do by mathematics, which I always felt I had mathematics talent, as I said, that those problems, there were not very many left, and that I'd have to change fields and really look into another field of theoretical physics. And in fact, I'd been looking into it, and the field was called statistical physics, where there's a lot of theory. But when I looked at the papers in statistical physics, it was clear that I would have to spend 3 years of very hard work before I could get to a point where I could do the kind of theoretical work which I wanted to do in theoretical physics and statistical physics. And then a light bulb flashed over my head and said, 3 years, gee, 3 years, you can do a hell of a lot of things. You can go to law school. So I decided I would go to law school. And I applied to go to law school, and I was accepted. And I was careful to go to law school as far away as possible from Pittsburgh, because if I was going to flunk out of law school, which I felt was not unlikely, since I was 56 at the time, I figured I'd want to flunk out a long way away from Pittsburgh. But, was that it?
No, keep quoting.
But I got my law degree. I'd actually hoped, I didn't intend to practice or anything, I actually hoped to get a joint appointment in physics and the law, and I really don't again know why that didn't come through. There have been various things in my life where things didn't come through where I expected. This was one of them. So what happened was I floundered for a while, didn't quite know what to do, but then I was offered a position as a member of the Pennsylvania Environmental Hearing Board. And that was a job in which the governor appointed you had to be confirmed by the state senate. And when I went to my confirmation hearing, the only thing he wanted to know was what was I going to do with my job at Pitt, because they refused to appoint me unless I resigned from the University of Pittsburgh. And I just had this choice, and since I had really not done anything in my legal career to that point, and the University of Pittsburgh had just instituted an early retirement program, I decided that's what I would do. So I resigned from the University of Pittsburgh at that point, and I did this work which it was I enjoyed. It was a 6-year appointment. And then...
Was it as an administrative judge?
As an administrative law judge, yes, in which I heard cases of a fairly high-class judge. I mean, I was really a judge. And I wrote a lot of opinions, which, as a matter of fact, can be found on the web now. There are published opinions. And then I went back to the University of Pittsburgh afterward, and I became a legal consultant. All this was in environmental law, which was a specialty I'd done in law school. I became a consultant for a law firm of counsel, so-called. The law firm was called Roche-Schmidt, Hazley and DeSalle. Actually, it was not, at that time, it was not Hazley. But in any event, no sooner did I join it than it started to deteriorate. I mean, it had about 40 people in it, and they lost this group, and they lost that group. And the law firm finally died about 2 years ago. It just ended. But I've been doing...
Excuse me, I think the tape is going to die.
Okay.
Let's change the tape.
Want me to turn it off?
Yeah.
Okay.
Larry?
Well, first I'd like to just comment on Sid. When he became chancellor, you used to call him Chancy. And also, you were
It
very
was
good.
chancy.
And also, before you became the chancellor, you were going to have a couple of meetings with various important people. And so when Grace and I and you and Ruth would eat out together, she was very careful to keep criticizing your eating habits, which fork you use and so forth, so you should have the right habits when you went with these big shots.
It was in training.
And he still
She's
has
training
friends, and he never listened, and he never listened.
Am I supposed to go now?
Yes.
Well, I didn't have the kind of variety of experience that either of the two of you had. Mine was rather monolithic in a way. It was essentially always physics. And I remember one time, Dan asked me, how can you do quantum mechanics for 50 years? But in point of fact, if you look at the quantum mechanics books at the end of my career and the quantum mechanics books at the beginning of my career, there were vast segments that wouldn't have existed at the beginning. There were all kinds of new developments. All in all, I would say that it was a magnificent choice I made by pot luck or whatever, and it's worked out very, very well. We've had various advantages. The fact that Grace herself is a physicist has helped because it means when we go abroad, it's easier for her to get into the system. 1 year we spent at Oxford, and she had a fellowship at American Association of University Women and was working full time, so it was easy for her. And on other occasions, she was doing some writing, and so she would interview various people and so forth. So it worked out very well, and we have estimated that we've spent about 7 years of our lives living outside of the country. And of course, I spent about 3 years of my life in Aspen, Colorado, if you add up all the months I spent out there. And since I have an innate love of mountains, that was a marvelous place to be. And also, we've been at some of the major universities in the world. I mean, I spent about 1.5 years at Harvard. I spent 2 years at MIT. I spent a few months at the University of California. I worked at the Los Alamos laboratory for about a month or so. And in Europe, I've been in all the major universities. I mean, we were at the Bohr Institute, the main institute in Denmark. We were at Heidelberg University, which is the main university in Germany. We spent a year at Oxford and 9 months at Cambridge, 6 months at Cambridge, and 3 months at University College. I mean, they're the best places available.
And Paris.
And University of Paris. I spent a term at the Institute for Advanced Study. So it's been a terrific time. I mean, I think it's been a blessing. And now I have certain physical problems, and it's my therapy to sit around and do physics, because there are a lot of things I can't do.
Well, when did you first meet Grace?
I met her in graduate school when I was leaving Penn, and she was arriving at Penn. My last year and her first year overlapped, and so that's what I said. We didn't get engaged at that time, but we sort of understood we were going to get married. And then my second year at MIT, she came up. And there's another person who was very not influential so much as a model. We spent a year at Oxford University when Grace had her own fellowship, and I was working with Piles. And again, I don't know whether God came down, the God I don't believe in, came down and blessed me, but I mean, Piles is one of the nicest people on the planet, as well as being one of the smartest. And it was just a joy to be there at the time he was there. And all kinds of stories that people tell about Piles, and every one of the stories always has to do with what a nice man he was, and how he did this and how he did that, and how his wife, who was a little bit on the kooky side, but very intelligent, but she had certain problems. She was inviting people there day and night. You go there for dinner, then you show up and you say something about you like the chopped liver. The next day, Sir Rudolph Piles knocks on your door, and he comes in, and he says, Larry, he says, and gives you a little bag of chopped liver to put aside for him. I mean, it was just, there'd been some very wonderful people, and by definition, for a long period of time, the only people who went into physics were the best people. It's not true now. So if you're associated with physicists, you were associated with people who were smart. I mean, I've seen studies at the time that I got out of college. If you took the English majors and the physics majors knew more literature than the English majors. It was just a different caliber of people. And so you're associating all the time with very nice people. You have the chance. We spent 2 months in China on a program in which you travel around like a big shot. There's somebody meets you at the airport. You have a driver and an interpreter, and it's a wonderful thing to do. And you meet some of the smartest kids in all of China. And with 1.25 billion people, the smartest kids all over China are goddamn smart. So, and some of them I've had dealings with over the years, and it's been, all in all, I can't think of a better way to have spent my life.
Don't forget all the meetings you've been to all over the world, including Russia.
Oh, meetings, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Russian experience was very special. And you always were impressed with the fact that I took this bus ride, knew no word, and I knew I had to get off near a lake. And I couldn't see the lake, I was going to go near the lake. So I walked.
This was in
Well, is that when we took?
Leningrad, in Leningrad.
Yeah, when we were in Leningrad, isn't that when we went to,
No, he wanted to go swimming. This was a special.
oh, this
thing
was
which he
another
did by
time, not
himself.
that bus that you and I
No, it wasn't
took
that
up
bus.
to.
But I didn't speak a word of Russian,
Yeah.
and so Grace knew some, but not enough.
No,
You
I
weren't-
wasn't
you weren't
with you.
there.
You were
weren't-
alone.
No,
and
so
you
He
were
was
down
with, he was with me.
Yeah, oh.
Yeah, I went with Ben. I walked up and down the aisle going,
In the bus.
in the bus. And the point was, I knew I was going to go by the lake, and I figured somebody's going to figure out what the hell I'm doing. And sure enough, at the appropriate time, somebody said to me, get off here. So I've had lots of fun traveling around. And China was a marvelous experience for 2
Not
months.
to mention Nepal and Tibet.
Oh, Nepal and Tibet
Let-
and a lot of other places we've been to.
Let me say a few. Are you through?
Yeah, through.
I should say, first of all, I haven't mentioned my wife Jacqueline, whom I met at
I'm
Berkeley.
sorry?
Well, we were going to get to that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Now's the time.
All right. Well, I met my wife Jacqueline in Berkeley shortly after I got there. We got to met her through our mutual friend Leon Saperstein, who brought me to Berkeley, and we got married in 1940. I've been married ever since, and I shall leave Jacqueline to describe how wonderful a relationship it has been.
Well, I have to tell about my wife.
Yeah, just a
What did-
second.
what
Well,
did-
I want to say something.
Yeah, but I want to say.
Wait a minute, wait.
Yeah, but I just want to say the following. I mean, I heard Larry describe his career, and I think. Yeah. I heard Larry describe his career. I wanted to say a few words, about my career. I mean, it was clear to me from the beginning that there are some people who are much smarter than I. Schwinger was one, for example. But there weren't that many. I mean, in my opinion, there's a super rank, and there are ranks below that, and I was one of the ranks below that, not too far. And I think I've had a quite respectable career as a physicist. What I haven't had, for some reason or other, I really don't understand. See, I have not had a chance to associate with Weisskopf or with Piles or so on. I've really been pretty much on my own. I mean, I have never had a chance to really work, even with Oppenheimer, I didn't really work with him that closely. The only person I really would work closely with was Schwinger, the really, really good person.
That's something.
Yeah, that's something. But I, nonetheless, I went on publishing. I published really quite respectably. I did not feel that, as I say, the way Sidney did, that my career as a physicist was over. What happened was, as I say, that I came to a certain point in my career where I felt that exhausted pretty much the kind of physics I've been doing, namely in theoretical atomic physics, and I had to do something else. And it seemed to me, since I was really getting on in years, I got my law degree at 59, that it wasn't a bad idea. I might prolong my career in a certain sense by merging the law and physics, and although it did not work out quite the way I wanted to, it wasn't so bad.
I think we didn't hear about Ruth Borowitz yet. We didn't hear about Ruth.
Who was that?
About Ruth, I met Ruth on Hoover
I just
Street
want to say one thing.
in Brooklyn.
On just about Eddie, I have still tell people that Eddie is the smartest guy I've ever met. Because Eddie, I don't know anything about physics or his physics career, but I think that Eddie is a smart guy in all areas. Except that when we were first married, he used to interrupt my wedding, my honeymoon period, by coming to visit and staying till 3 o'clock in the morning.
That doesn't sound so smart.
Young and foolish
Well-
then.
That's why I said there's an exception.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something that I came from a small town in Southern California, near Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles suburbs. And I started, no money, started out my academic career in a what is now a community college, but then it was Los Angeles Junior College. And I had to spend 3 years there because you couldn't get a job. So I got interested in science then. I was a French major, but I also was interested in science, and I did something in bacteriology. Anyway, then I was able to get up to Berkeley and do my upper division work at Berkeley, and that's where I met Ed. And I want to say that the impact of meeting all these guys, of Ed, Eddie, and Leo Saperstein, and Sidney actually was spent some time in Berkeley, and we had a couple of traumatic experiences too, which we won't go into, but it was. Oh, I'm talking to them. It was really a complete change in my life. The kind of people that I met were just entirely different from anyone I had known before, and New York was a foreign country to me as far as that was concerned, and it was a whole new world, and it was a great new world, and as Eddie said, we've had a 64-year marriage now.
How long?
It's 64 years this August.
With Ed?
This month. So,
I've been married 62 years.
anyway, I just wanted to say that what a cultural shock it was to meet all those people at Berkeley and to meet all the New York Jews. A group.
I don't like that phrase. I don't like that phrase.
Well, we haven't heard from Grace yet.
Okay.
Race.
You've heard bits and pieces about me from Larry, so I don't really have anything to
Anything
add.
more now?
I don't know if you want to know about my career. I mean, it was their career that
Right.
is important. So, the only thing that I might add is that, in a way, I think Larry may have had it a little easier that I was in physics because I understood how hard it was, and so I would let him have all the time that he wanted. A friend of mine who was not in this field could never understand how come. I mean, I would say Larry is working. We couldn't go there or someplace else, and I understood, and I never put anything in his way. But various of my friends thought that I was sacrificing. I knew I wasn't sacrificing. I knew what the joys were.
Okay, Sidney, did you want to say that when you got married?
No.
No?
But I would like to say regarding our marriage, Sidney was really always a marvelous husband who, and I, in a sense, kept him back from many of the things that he would have achieved. For one thing, when we had kids, he spent an inordinate amount of time with the children, which really, you can't be, I think, a great writer or a great this if you're going to divide your time so much and have many loves. And his major love, I think, were the children. I mean, he was a marvelous father, and that was always a conflict to him between the time he spent with the children, for the children, as opposed to the time that he spent on his career. And so I will say there's only 24 hours in the day, and Sidney did his PhD thesis on our dining room table, living room table, in between helping with the diapering and paying attention to the kids. And that was a great, in a way, a handicap, because he was a better father, I think, than I was a mother.
Let me say something else that's not been mentioned. You know, Larry and I, which has not been mentioned, Larry and I have collaborated on a number of papers together. And certainly that was one of the more pleasant experiences that I've had in my life working with Larry. And maybe Larry is not Schwinger, but he really was a very good guy to work with, and I hope he'll say the same about me. I mean, I felt it was a good collaboration. It's too bad we couldn't do more.
Well, I certainly thought so, although I wouldn't have done it over a period of years.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's time to wrap it up.
Could I say one
Yes,
thing?
of course.
One thing. It's been a great joy to me to meet I've known Ruthie and Grace now, and Ruthie longer, of course, for many, many years. And we don't see each other that often, but we're good friends, and when we do see each other, it's like we were never apart. And it's really been a great joy to me to be associated with Larry. And Sidney, and Grace, and Ruth.
And what has not been said is that Sidney and I have really been very good friends over our lifetime. We got to know each other when we were still in high school. I was in Thomas Jefferson. He was in the math team at the Boys High. And we met each other again in New York in City College. And it really was a lifelong association. It was a great association.
I once even broke Eddie's wrist.
What was that?
I said I once even broke Eddie's wrist.
Playing handball.
We were playing handball.
Can I say one thing which you can take out at the end if you want? I've been very impressed with this session at what I think is the honesty of it. I'm amazed at modesty in places where I didn't expect it at all. It's been practically a therapy session as far as I can see, where people said honest things that well, I at least did not expect it. Maybe that says something more about me than anything else, but I found it impressive.
It didn't surprise me one bit. I was just doing a little mental arithmetic, and I added up the years of marriage, and there's approximately 180 years worth of marriage in this room, in this group of three couples, all to the same people. This may be a Guinness Book of Records. It's really a remarkable achievement by everybody here. And I have one further thing I want to say. I want to change places with Betty.
She's got the best light on, once again, on her good side.
I just wanted to say that this session today was organized by Betty, who did a lot of the groundwork in getting this equipment going, and in learning how to operate it. You have to understand we're rank amateurs. We've never filmed anything in our lives. So thank you again, Betty. Okay, we're finished.
Well, I think all of us would like to give our thanks to Ben and Betty.
Yes.
Yeah. Dan, it was a great idea. It was a great
It was a
idea.
great idea.
Oh, I
It was
forgot-
a great idea.
I forgot to load the
The
camera.
first time I ever saw that was when the
Joe.
Russian dancers came to the United States and applauded the
Only kidding.
I'd never seen it before.
We just scared that bird.